Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Ryan Sandell, and welcome to the third lecture of this Introduction to Phonology. This week we're going to be concerning ourselves with the system of phonological features introduced in Chapter 4 of Hayes' textbook. For an introduction to some similar ideas, you can also read the fourth chapter of Tracy Allen Hall's textbook, though there are some slight differences between the feature systems presented there, which I'll mention some points during this lecture. Next week, we'll start talking about morphology and interactions between phonology and morphology a little bit. And for that, you should read chapters 5 and 6 of Hayes' textbook for our fourth lecture. For those of you following this course at the Ludwig-Maximilians-Universität, the first homework assignment is due on Wednesday of this week. That is on the 6th of May. That assignment has been online for you to download since last week. So if you're planning to submit that, you should submit that by 2 p.m. On Wednesday. Okay, before we begin to dig into the feature system presented in Hayes' textbook in detail, I'd first like to review the concept of natural classes a little bit. So thus far in our work on the analysis of phonemes that we've undertaken in the first 2 weeks of this course, we have already been dependent on this idea of a natural class. And the reason that natural classes are crucial in phonological analysis is that we need them in order to say what sounds are subject to a given process. Now, in order today to first of all make our notion of a so-called natural class more precise, and then move towards developing a system of phonological features, we're going to first here try to precisely define what a natural class is, and then I want to go into a little more work on how to identify natural classes. First, I'll work with the definition that Hayes gives on page 43 of his textbook. A natural class is any complete set of sounds to the exclusion of all other sounds in the language that share the same values for a feature or some set of features. And when we talk about a set of sounds here, I'm going to be borrowing this traditional set notation from mathematics that uses curly brackets to indicate what members belong to a set. So for instance, if we have a language that say has stops, has voiceless stops at 3 places of articulation, labials, coronals, and velars, we could talk about a set of voiceless stops in this language as the sound p-t-k, for instance. And that could potentially be a natural class in a number of languages. Now, to more precisely exemplify how some natural classes might look in a specific language, let's consider again the inventory of sounds from the O'odham language that we already saw in lecture 1. Now, in many cases, I think you will find, insofar as you are already familiar with the notions of place and manner of articulation, which hopefully you are, and you've been able to review that using the first chapter of Hayes' textbook. Insofar as you are already familiar with those concepts of place and manner of articulation, identifying natural classes in a lot of instances is going to be fairly obvious and intuitive. But as we'll see when we move into using some of the terminology from Hayes' feature system, there will arise some other somewhat less intuitive combinations, and you'll need to be aware of some slight differences in terminology. All right, first in examples 2 and 3, I reproduce the system of vowels and system of consonants in O'odham. And remember that the sounds given here reflect the phones of the language, not the phonemes of the language. As you recall, we had discovered that in lecture 1 that the palato-alveolar affricates are allophones of the same phonemes as the alveolar stops. So let's consider some possible natural classes that we consider that we could make out of these sounds. So for instance, each possible combination, pairwise combination of place and manner of articulation constitutes a natural class. So for instance, we can talk about all stops in the language. So the first row in the table of consonants as constituting a natural class. So that would be these two labial stops, p and b. The two labial stops, p and b, the two alveolar stops, da and da, the retroflex stop, da. I'm going to copy that in since I can't remember the key combination to type that, and the two velar stops. So there we have one natural class. If we wanted to identify a natural class consisting just of some consonants that have the same manner of articulation, we could look at the 4 consonants found in the alveolar column. And there we have 2 stops, the stops ta and da, one fricative, sa, and a nasal, n. So each of these 2 groups would be a natural class. And in the first 2 lectures, we have used sort of informal phonological features that just refer to place and manner, for instance, of articulation of consonants. So for instance, if we talk about consonants having the feature plus stop, all right, all of the consonants in this first row here, we would say are plus stop, whereas all of the consonants with a different manner of articulation would have the feature minus stop. When we come to vowels, let's turn now to the vowel system under 2. There are features like front, back, high and low, and also round. So for instance, the vowels O and U would be characterized as having the feature plus round by having lip rounding in the articulation of those vowels. Those features are relevant, it turns out, and we'll discuss this more later in today's lecture. Those are relevant for some consonants too, in particular the dorsal consonants, consonants articulated using the tongue body. So for that reason, when we identify natural classes of vowels, we will always want to add the feature plus syllabic, and we'll assume that vowels all bear the feature plus syllabic, meaning that a syllable nucleus is built around that vowel preferentially. So for instance, if we look at all vowels, all plus syllabic segments in O'odham that have the feature that are high, then we have a group of 6 vowels here in pairs of long and short vowels, I, and U. And if we identified, for instance, the vowels that are rounded, and we use the feature plus round, but without specifying the feature plus syllabic in this language, the feature round will pick out these 4 back vowels, U and O, with corresponding long vowels. And among the consonants, also the labiovelar glide, wa, is also characterized by the feature round. In the phones that we find in the O'odham language, there are no other rounded consonants here. Now, when we devised our rule of alveolar stop affrication in order to account for the distribution of alveolar and palatoalveolar allophones in O'odham in the first lecture, there we had to make reference to 2 particular natural classes. We needed to use natural classes in order to say, first of all, what sound the rule applies to, and secondly, what the conditions are under which that rule applies. So firstly, the natural class consisting of sounds that are in O'odham that are plus stop and plus alveolar in this feature system, we can see that that picks out sort of one square in our table here that focuses in on the alveolar stops. And the conditions under which the affrication of stops occurs, if you think back to our analysis, remember we had determined that the underlying, we should posit as the underlying representation for the 2 phonemes in O'odham as being stops, ta and da, excuse me. And these palatoalveolar affricates are generated purely by this rule. And the condition under which this affrication occurs was in the context preceding any high vowel. So there we have one natural class. So we have a natural class here, one natural class, which specifies what undergoes the process, and the environment, the context for the application of this process specified by the vowels that are plus syllabic and plus high. So we had already noted that right here on the handout. That set of 6 vowels constitutes a natural class in O'odham. Okay, now in some cases, simply reading off of these charts that we've composed, which divide up vowels by height and frontness and backness, and divide up consonants by place and manner of articulation, is not always going to be sufficient for finding sounds that probably do constitute a natural class. So for instance, if we were to find in O'odham or some other language with a similar inventory of sounds, and we wanted to define a natural class consisting of all the vowels and the 2 glides to the exclusion of all of the other consonants, how would we do that? What feature would we want to use? And for instance, if we wanted to find a natural class of consonants, of all consonants, with the exception of the nasals and the glides, so that is a natural class putting together fricatives, affricates, and stops, how would we do that? So it's clear, indeed, there are languages and there are processes that will need to refer to such groups as being natural classes, and therefore we need somewhat more precise and sophisticated terminology in order to divide those groups. So for instance, just to quickly sort of give away the answers here, we might say that glides are non-consonantal consonants. That sounds a bit unintuitive, but they are segments which are neither syllabic, they're not a syllable nucleus, but they are not consonantal either. And then the feature sonorant, which has been around and exists in virtually all phonological feature systems that have been devised during the 20th and 21st century. The feature sonorant could be used to distinguish nasals and glides from the other consonants, and putting together sonorants with the feature minus syllabic would specify that those are not syllable nuclei, since, as we'll see, the feature sonorant also characterizes all vowels normally. So our overall point here is that we're going to need a sophisticated system of phonological features in order to be able to put together groups of sounds that seem to belong together in some way. And as far as, for instance, these 2 groups that we can't read directly off of the charts in 2 and 3, because most phoneticians and phonologists would agree that these groups that we talked about here, so all vowels plus glides, or all consonants with the exception of nasals and glides, have some common properties. We need to develop some terms to define how those sounds should belong together. And then finally, the overall goal that we're aiming for today is then to try to better and more efficiently express the commonalities, the things that certain sounds share. And when we work that out in detail, as Hayes has done for his textbook, the result then is a system of phonological features.